high school, elementary school, etc. in the back if anyone's interested. You're also welcome to stay out here if you feel like it. Whatever you want to do. What have we been talking about the last couple weeks? Jesus. We've been talking about Jesus. Hopefully every single day, but we're focusing really on the acts of Jesus throughout the scriptures this entire year, specifically over the last 2 weeks. Anyone remember? We've been talking about Jesus in the Old Testament. Places where Jesus shows up before Jesus shows up in Bethlehem. Following? So we talked about Jesus in creation. How John makes it very, very clear that Jesus was there before anything else was because Jesus is God. God is eternal. We talked about Jesus in the Exodus. That one's a little bit harder to see until you read the book of Jude. And Jude says that Jesus led his people out of Egypt. Then you look back at Exodus and you realize it doesn't say Jesus anywhere in it, but Jude says, no, he's there. So we talked about that. Now I want to talk about Jesus in the book of Joshua. Joshua is not a favorite book of mine. Makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Because the book of Joshua is very comfortable with an idea that as a young Western male, grew up in a college town, Joshua's comfortable with this thing that I know in my head is true, but it makes me uncomfortable, and that is that sometimes fighting is necessary. See, we like to think, because we're privileged to grow up in an era of history that is relatively very peaceful, especially in our neck of the woods. We like to think often that war is unnecessary, that world peace is attainable. And these are wonderful ideas, and I've read the scriptures. One day, world peace, if you want to call it that, will be attained. But not in this era, and not with you or I in charge. In the meantime, we're promised time and time again in the scriptures that not only will there be wars and famine and disease, that at times we're going to suffer from them. Moreover, at times we're going to suffer more than everyone else because we are Christians and we will be targeted for our faith. Or we will already be suffering, and while no one is targeting us, we will be expected, because we are loyal to Jesus, to give out of our poverty to others. Joshua is comfortable, the book and the person it's named for, with the idea that war is a part of life, that sometimes we just have to fight. And even the most pacifistic amongst us, I think, really know in our hearts that this is true. Many of you are parents. Many of you, your children maybe have grown up and moved out, others maybe not. But put yourself back in time, when your child was about yay tall. Imagine you're home alone, your spouse isn't there, and a stranger comes in through the door with a weapon in their hand. What do? Some of you are being very realistic about your abilities. You're like, yell really loud and hope someone hears me. And honestly, you don't know what you're going to do in that situation. If you haven't been in that kind of situation before, you don't know how you're going to behave. But you would hope that you would be willing to put yourself between that stranger and your children. You would hope that you would have the courage, the bravery to fight if necessary, to defend those that you love. I don't know. I don't have any kids. I don't know for certain what I would do if someone came into my house and was threatening my wife, but I hope I would have the courage, the bravery, and the strength to protect her. Most of us hope we would, because we know that sometimes it is appropriate to fight. After the events of 9/11, as a nation, we decided that sometimes it's necessary to fight. If we're going to feel safe in our workplaces, safe in our homes, that there was some need to defend ourselves. You guys want to take a wild guess? What modern president has the highest approval rating at a singular point in their presidency? George W. Bush. Not because everyone magically became a Republican after 9/11. That is clearly not what happened. But because there was one issue that virtually everyone agreed on. Gallup polls had his approval rating as high as 90%. Because everyone agreed that we needed to protect ourselves. That sometimes it's necessary to fight. Now, we disagreed on where to fight, who to fight, how long to fight, what the fight should look like. We disagreed on everything we could possibly disagree on. But we agreed on one thing. Sometimes it's necessary to fight. And the book of Joshua is all about that. That sometimes it's necessary to fight. But this raises a question for me, and I hope it does for you as well. Because if you've been going to church for a little bit, you've probably heard that God should be involved in all parts of your life. That He should change how you think and how you speak and how you handle your money. That you should consider Him when you vote. That God should touch every part of your life. And if that's true, and if sometimes fighting is necessary, then I want to know, what is my God like in a fight? Not just does He win, He's God, I assume He does, but how does He behave? How does He go about His business? What are His priorities? When God has to fight, what is it like? I want to look at a kind of a weird passage today out of the book of Joshua, a passage where I think Jesus shows up. And here's what I want to do. I want to read through it once. I won't give you much context. We'll just read through it once. And I want to prove the point to you that this is Jesus that we're talking about, that shows up in this passage. And then I want to walk back through it a little bit slower and talk a little bit about this question. What is God like in a fight? Now, honestly, if we want to answer this question entirely, we need to read the entire scriptures time and time and time again, because the Bible is, in a very real way, a book about war. About the war between those who follow God and those who do not. About the war between God and against those who would oppose Him and all the different iterations that it takes. So if we wanted to answer this question entirely, we need to read the entire Bible over and over and over again. And that's a lifetime of study that we can't compress into 30 or 40 minutes. But I think we can discover a really important core to the answer to this question about what God is like in a fight if we study through. But first of all, let's establish that we're actually talking about God here, that Jesus actually shows up in this passage. We'll be in Joshua chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. I think I have the NASB up here. You can follow along whatever translation you feel like. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, which was a city, he raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite of him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And the man replied, "No. Rather, I have come now as captain of the army of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the ground, bowed down, and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Who was that? Jeez, you guys are like, you told us. We know the answer. I've been in Sunday school. The answer is always Jesus. Sounds like a squirrel, but it's probably Jesus. How do we know? Let's talk about that for a second. Here's the first thing. When Joshua sees him and he says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" That's a wise question. You're about to wage war. You're about to have the first battle of what's going to be a very long campaign to take over what we now call Palestine, what is modern-day Israel. You're going to have your first battle in the land, and you see someone out there standing all by his lonesome with a sword in his hand. You're going, is he on our side, their side, or is he just crazy? Right? So he asks, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And the reply We'll dig into it again in a minute. But part of the reply, he says, I'm captain of the army of the Lord. Some translations say commander of the Lord's army. However you want to render that, doesn't make a big difference. I'm in charge of the armies of the Lord. Out of all the people groups on the face of the earth, which people group, which nation was God's people in this period of history? Israel. Now, you Bible scholars out there, who's in charge of Israel's army? The army of God's people. So it's a Jesus person that's right in front of them. Joshua. He's their leader. He's their general. So if anyone on the face of the earth could claim this title, that I am commander of the Lord's army, it would be Joshua, right? So he sees this stranger out in the field, asks him who he is, and this person replies, I am the commander of the Lord's army. And Joshua seems to accept it. He immediately recognizes this person has more authority than I have. He doesn't say, that's my title, right? That's my corner office. That's not what he does. He immediately recognizes this person has more claim to that title than I do. And then he falls to his face on the ground and bows down. Now, some of your translations might say he falls down in reverence. Some might say he falls down in worship. There's not a term here that explicitly means reverence or worship. It just says he falls onto the ground, bows down to this person, which can just be a sign of great respect. There are some passages where someone does this before a king or before an envoy of a king. This can just be a sign of great respect. And by itself, I would probably just take it that far. But there's a little bit more to it. First of all, Joshua says, what does my Lord say to his servant? This is a sentence that is only said to messengers from God or to God himself. People say it to prophets, they say it to angels, and they say it to God. What does my Lord say to me? What message have you brought me? So whoever this is, at the very least, they have a message from God that Joshua recognizes. Whoever this person or angel or whatever is, they at least have a message from God. They're at least representing him. And Joshua is at least showing great reverence. At least. But in the end of this little passage, the commander of the Lord's army says something really interesting. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. The last time that we had a sentence like that in the scriptures, if you're reading from Genesis through Revelation, you want to guess the last time you run into a sentence like that? When Moses is wandering around in Midian, because he's killed a man and he ran away so he wouldn't be punished. And God wants to call him back to Egypt to lead his people out, to bring them to the promised land. And he walks by one day while he's herding sheep, and he sees a bush that's on fire. He goes, fire. Cool. And then he keeps walking. And then he walks back by a little bit later, and still on fire. Okay. He leaves. He walks back by again later, and he realizes this thing is not burning up. It's just hanging out here. And so he does what any good pyromaniac would do, and he goes and checks it out. And then the bush talks to him. Because that's not just a bush. That is, for some reason, the way that God chose to depict himself at that time. God shows up in person, and one of the first things he says to him is, take off your shoes, where you are is holy. And the commander of the Lord's army says the exact same thing. Because where God's presence is, that place is holy. And I don't want you tracking in all that junk that you got on your feet out there. I don't want you bringing in the outside world into this special place, so take off your shoes. And we continue reading in chapter 6. There's a horrible chapter division here that breaks the scene in half. The very next thing that happens is the scriptures tell us the Lord said to Joshua. Who's talking? Commander of the Lord's army, which in chapter 6 is identified as the Lord. This is God. After all, who is the commander of God's armies? God is. And in the book of Revelation, we see Jesus pictured as a warrior who is leading his armies and leading his faithful servants, both angels and us. Not that I think there'll be some grand battle that we'll participate in. There was a few sects of Jewish people that believed that, but it simply wasn't based on the scriptures. A battle with Jesus at the head is over pretty quickly. A snap of the fingers and then it's done. But nonetheless, angels are depicted as an army, as a host. The Psalms actually call God the Lord of hosts, but in Revelation specifically, Jesus is pictured as the warrior king that leads these armies. Who is the commander of the Lord's armies? I think it's Jesus. With that in mind, what does this passage tell us about how Jesus handles a fight? Let's talk a little bit about where the people of God are at. We'll dig back into that passage and we'll answer that question. The people of God had found themselves in a very difficult place just over 40 years prior. They were in the land of Egypt, a superpower at that time. One of the most powerful nations economically, politically, and militarily in the entire world, at least in that region. No one messed with Egypt. And while the Israelites had enjoyed some status for a time, a new family, a new dynasty came to power and found these Israelites, these Hebrews, to be a threat. And so they enslaved them, placed restrictions on them, forced them into labor. And over time, their abuses became worse and worse. Eventually, God said, enough is enough. It's time for me to fulfill my promises that I made to their ancestors, that I would one day take them out of Egypt, bring them back into Israel, and give them that land. And so he sent Moses, the first, and many would say the greatest prophet, to guide his people out of Egypt, through the wilderness, and into Israel. And Moses does so. Last week, what our sermon was about, talking about how Jesus shows up in those events, how he works through Moses. And it only takes a little bit of time for the people to end up in Israel. It's not that long of a journey. But once they get there, they do the sensible thing. They gather up some spies, some scouts, to send them into the land. After all, no one there had ever been to the land of Canaan before, what would become Israel. So they wanted to see what it was like. What kind of resistance can we expect? How many people are living here? What does the farmland look like? Is it good for raising cows or for sheep or chickens? What can we do with it? So they send some spies, one from each major family, one from each tribe in Israel, except for the Levites, who are set aside as priests, as servants in the temple or the tabernacle before it. And these 12 spies go out, and two of them, their names are Joshua, same guy that we just read about a minute ago, and another guy named Caleb. They see these massive, high-walled fortress cities, these awesome armies, these people who are well-fed and strong and mighty kings with all of these riches in the land, and they go, they're not as tough as God. God can take them, and God's on our side. And if God's on our side, then they don't stand a chance. So I'm not worried about it. And they go back to give their report, and they say, we need to go into the land. The issue is the other 10 guys didn't agree. And they convinced the people, the leaders of the people, to say that we should not go into the land, that God could not possibly conquer these people. They're too rich, they're too strong, their walls are too high, and we're just a bunch of former slaves. How could we ever possibly win against them? We're not trained in the art of war. We don't have money and allies at our back. The only weapons that we have are the ones we stole from the Egyptians on our way out. We can't win. And so God told them, because you didn't trust me, I'm going to send you back into the desert, back into the Sinai Peninsula, and you will wander around for 40 years. And many, many people will die every day from natural causes, from war, from disease. And when the entire generation that has disobeyed me has died, your children and your grandchildren will come into the land, and I will give Israel to them instead. And so it goes. But God makes an exception. Those who listen to him, Joshua and Caleb, they would be allowed into the land. Joshua was about 19 years old at the time. He was a young guy. Caleb was a little older, 30s, 40s. And God maintained his strength, so when he entered the land in his 80s, he was just as strong as in his youth. Wouldn't that be nice? I'm in my mid-20s and my joints are already starting to crack. Caleb's 80 and he's out here like bench pressing 400 pounds. It's unbelievable. But God maintained him, and he was a mighty warrior when they entered into the land. Joshua, he grew older and wiser, but he stayed strong and fit. Dude ends up living to be 110 years old. He's a healthy guy. Well, when they finally returned, Moses had sinned in his own ways and so was not permitted to enter into the promised land. Moses dies and Joshua takes over. After being Moses' second in command for over 40 years, he finally takes over as the leader of the people of Israel, and he leads them into the promised land. The first place they are to conquer is the city of Jericho. They pause for a little bit. They have some responsibilities that they have to fulfill under the covenant that they have with God. They throw a giant party called the Passover. They also have to circumcise every male in the nation. You can read about that story in the chapters leading up to this one. And after they've recovered from the festivities, if you will, they're prepared to make war. And they head on towards the city of Jericho. And Jericho is not a particularly large city, but it's a well-fortified one with high walls and a strong militia. It was not going to be easy to take. And Joshua, of course, heads out into the field. He wants to take a look at the city. After all, 40 years ago, he was one of the first spies into the land. Why shouldn't he be one of the first to lay his eyes on Jericho? And as he's out there by himself, looking around, trying to figure out how on earth do I get through this city, this stranger appears. Now let's look at this story again. This stranger, this person that I think is Jesus, shows up as Joshua was by Jericho. A man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. A sword drawn in his hand. What's a sword for? War. For battle. Yeah, that one wasn't a trick question. You guys get good. You stop there for a second and you're like, oh no, you've gotten us a few times today. Yeah, it's for war, it's for battle. After Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, God places an angel with a what at the gate? With a sword, flaming sword, right? The sword at the gate. Sword means business. It's for battle. It's for war. Jesus shows up and he's equipped and ready to go. Joshua doesn't recognize who this is at first. So he looks at him, he says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And God replies, "No." What a good response. And I love this. I think this still speaks to us today. Because so often we wonder, is God on my side? So often we hear politicians on both sides of the aisle confidently exclaim that God is on their side. In my line of work, I see a lot of celebrity pastors, which are two words that probably shouldn't go together, declare that God is on their side. Especially right before and right after it gets found out that they're doing something horrible the pastor shouldn't be doing. Go figure. And Joshua asks the same question, not realizing who he's speaking to. He says, "Are you on my side?" And God replies, "I'm on my side." And I want you to understand, and this is something that I have to get through my thick skull too, we can't ask God, "Are you on my side?" He's on his side. God is unchanging. The fancy theological word is impassible. He doesn't change. He has his purposes, his plan, and you can choose to get on the bus or to get off the bus, but it's your choice, not his. God's going to do what God does, and you can be a part of it, or you can get in the way. And as Canaan is about to find out, getting in the way is not a good idea. We put it another way. I am a competitive person. I like to win. If you want to win, you want God on your team. Are you with us or with our enemies? No. I come as captain of the army of the Lord. And I think Joshua, at this point, when he realizes who he's speaking to, he falls on his face on the ground, right? He realizes I asked the wrong question to the wrong person. And now I'm going to submit myself to him. Joshua does the right thing. There's a fun thing with Joshua as he shows up, not only in this book, but throughout the Torah where he shows up as well. Joshua has no major sins, none that are recorded. Now, I'm not saying Joshua was perfect, but he's about as close as you can get. Moses had his great sins. He has his arguments with God. In fact, when he's called at the burning bush, one of the first things he does is make excuses for why he can't do the thing that God is asking him to do. Joshua never does that. Now, Joshua has a few small missteps, miscalculations, but we don't anywhere about Joshua have any sort of major sin recorded. We don't have any time where he resists God. If he has one thing going for him, it's that he knows when God speaks, I listen. There is no other choice. Sometimes I have conversations with Maggie when we have big decisions coming up. And a lot of the times I feel like there's no clear direction and I just have to choose. Even when I pray, even the handful of times that we fasted over some big decisions, whether it's stuff at the church, stuff in our personal life, whatever. Often I feel like there's no clear direction, but every once in a while there's this thing that I hope that you guys experience. It's not like God comes down out of heaven and speaks to me in an audible voice. That'd be super cool and terrifying, but really cool. But it's more like there's just this sense. I think I told Maggie a couple nights ago, we were talking about this. And I think I told her it's like a wall of no. Like there's this thing that I might personally want, that I could go do or I could go have. And there's just this sense. There's this wall of no. And it's not that the thing that I want is necessarily sinful, but there's just this sense that God's like, that's not what I have. That's not what I want you to do right now. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been there. It's such a bizarre feeling to know there's something you want and then just know it's not an option. That God is telling you no. And there's been a handful of times where I felt that. And maybe that's kind of similar to what Joshua is feeling here. That as soon as the commander of the Lord's army identifies himself, he realizes I am thinking about this all wrong. I'm asking if you're on my side, and what I need to be worrying about is, am I on your side? So Joshua fell on his face to the ground and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet. The place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Again, why do that? Why remove the sandals from your feet? It is, to some extent, a symbolic action. But Joshua doesn't need to be bringing in everything from the outside world with him. And maybe his sandals are a little symbolic of that. After all, I have dogs. Many of you guys do too. Sometimes when you're walking around the lawn, you find a landmine. You don't need to be tracking that into the presence of the Lord. A little bit more metaphorically, a little bit more symbolically, we all have baggage, right? We have the things that we've learned while we're out on the job, any degrees or training that we have, the things that we learned in high school, the things that we are taught, never with words, but by actions and the families that we grew up in. We have all these ideas about how the world should work that we carry with us, and Joshua did too. He was a leader. He was Moses' right-hand man. He was a mighty commander. And while this is the first battle in Israel, they had won many victories on the other side of the Jordan River already. He was an experienced strategist. And God's about to give him some really bizarre instructions. And Joshua can't carry that baggage into this conversation. Now, here's something that I know many of you have done, something that I've done. When you do receive some sort of clear instruction, you know that God is speaking to you. Maybe he does it in prayer. Maybe he speaks to you through the preacher or through one of the elders or through someone whose faith you respect. Maybe he speaks to you through the scriptures, and you know God has clear instructions for you, and you go, well, that's just not how the world works. Any of you? You ever done that? You go, I know better. And you never quite say it that way. It's, well, that's just not realistic. Or, well, you just don't understand. Or, well, okay, maybe God didn't really say that. Which, by the way, is what Satan says to Eve in the garden, so be careful with that one. When we carry our baggage, our presuppositions, this attitude of I know better, into our conversations with God, we can end up resisting. So take off your shoes. Quit carrying that outside stuff onto holy ground. Just listen to what God has to say, because sometimes his instructions don't make much sense. Sometimes we think we know better. But if you are certain that God is speaking, you have one choice. Listen or don't. Get on his side or get off. Here's the instructions that God gives in the next chapter. There's a little bit of context we're given here. We're told, dear reader, Jericho was tightly shut up because of the sons of Israel. No one went in and no one went out. But the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have handed Jericho over to you. Pause there. The Lord said to Joshua. Who is Joshua speaking to? The commander of the Lord's army. The person that I think is Jesus. Right? Here's the thing. We read these as two separate stories. But those numbers in your Bible, those are not original. They were added later so that people like me could stand on stage and say, open up to Joshua 6, verse 1, and you would know what we're talking about, right? That's why those were added. They are not original. In the original text, there would be no breaks, no numbers. There wouldn't even be paragraph divisions. In the New Testament and in the Greek translations of the Old Testament, there weren't even spaces because they wanted to conserve as much paper as possible. Paper was expensive. So it was just a string of letters. This is one continuous scene. Joshua is talking to who I think is Jesus, to the commander of the Lord's army. He's told, take off your shoes. We're given a little bit of information about Jericho, but the last question Joshua asked is, what does God want from me? And this is the answer he gets. See, I have handed Jericho over to you with its king and with the valiant warriors, and you shall march around the city, all the men circling the city once. And you shall do so for 6 days. Also, 7 priests will carry 7 trumpets made of ram's horns in front of the ark. And then on the 7th day, you shall march around the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall be that when they make the long blast with the ram's horns, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all of the people will shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, everyone straight ahead. In other words, with nothing getting in their way. Jericho is a mighty, fortified city. It has high walls. It's going to be hard to get into. We're told at the beginning of chapter 6, it's shut up because of the people of Israel. There's 2 ways generally in this era where you would take over a city. 2 general ways. One, the most common one by far, is you get a really big army and you surround the city so they can't get food in. And most of these fortified cities, if they had walls, which meant it was a prosperous, fairly strong city, usually the seat of a small country, but not always, they would have some food put away. But it's not going to last forever. Food spoils, like the leftovers you've had sitting in the back of your fridge for like 4 weeks. It's spoiled. And they had their ways of preserving food. They didn't have refrigerators. They had ways of preserving food, but eventually it would go bad. And if it didn't go bad, you'd run out eventually, right? We go grocery shopping every week, part of our ritual. Some people go grocery shopping every 2 weeks. Some every 4 weeks. I think you guys are crazy, but good for you if that's the way that you do it. The thing is, eventually, even if you're a doomsday prepper, you're going to run out of food. And when the city runs out of food, it spoils or they just eat all of it. They can either surrender or they can starve to death. Guess which one they normally did? They surrendered. That's one way you could take a city. Starve them out. The other way, made popular by the Assyrians, a little more interesting, a little more active, and a little more costly. You get a bunch of guys with really big shields made out of reeds. Not like metal shields. They look like baskets. They're pretty thick. They're good for catching arrows. They're really large and they're really light. And you have a bunch of guys get together, hold the shields up, and you have a bunch of laborers behind them. And the guys with the shields, their only job is to sit there and catch arrows or stones or whatever is getting thrown at these people. And the people behind them are carrying dirt. And you dump a big pile of dirt, and then you retreat. and then you come back with more dirt, and you make a really big dirt ramp. Any of you guys ever drive dirt bikes? Basically the same thing. Big old dirt ramp. And when it's big enough, you walk up it onto the walls and you kill everyone. Joshua was trying to figure out which one of those he was supposed to do when this guy shows up and says, a different strategy for you. And look, I know that you guys don't go back and read about like ancient wartime strategies. Well, maybe like Russ does, but most of you probably don't. But I can guarantee you, and I think most of you know this, that you will not find a text anywhere that says a legitimate war strategy in the ancient Near East is to walk around a city and then yell really loud and the walls will just fall down. Right? This is crazy. It's like when Jesus is calling those fishermen and he says, hey, throw the net off the side of the boat that's not designed to carry it. That'll work. Oh yeah, and do it in the deep waters where you're not supposed to fish. He's a carpenter. What does he know about fishing? This guy in the field, Joshua doesn't even know who he is. Well, he kind of does now. But Joshua, he's a master military leader. He knows how to take a city. And he's being told, ignore everything that you know about your trade. Ignore all the things that you've been taught. I have new instructions for you. And what does Joshua do? He listens. And what happens to Jericho's walls? They come tumbling down. And the people rush in, and they take the city. They kill every living thing besides one family that had aided them. Even the animals, they take no livestock. They take no goods. Anything that can't be burned is given to the temple, to the tabernacle. With the exception of one family, but they eventually cede the things that they take as well. It's a bloody story. Sometimes God finds it necessary to fight. It's not a comfortable story, especially not for us, because we're so used to living very peaceful lives. But maybe it's a necessary one. What's God like in a fight? Well, he doesn't do things our way. He doesn't ask us if we want him on our team, in our political party, behind the military of our nation. He does things his way. And we can decide to be on his side or not. What is God like in a fight? He fights his way, not ours. And sometimes God fights very peacefully. In fact, Jesus is the one that told us, if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. He's the one who tells us that if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If they take your cloak, give also your tunic. If they make you go with them 1 mile, go 2 instead. The way my teachers, my parents used to put it, kill them with kindness. And his followers repeat it. We're told also in Scripture that if we teach, or if we act kindly to people, despite them mistreating us, that we will heap burning coals on their head. It'll be unbearable for them. We're told in the epistles that we should behave in such a manner that when people lodge false complaints against us, that everyone observing knows that they're full of it. It's a paraphrase. Sometimes God fights peacefully, and sometimes he doesn't. Jesus says in his earthly ministry that he came not to bring peace, but to bring a sword, that he would divide families, parents against children, and siblings against one another. We read in Paul's epistles that there are situations where especially women had come to believe in Jesus and to follow the church, and they were abandoned by their husbands because of it. Sometimes Jesus does bring a fight. Sometimes he brings division. Sometimes following Jesus is violent. Not necessarily that we're called to violence, not in the way that Israel was, but many followers of Jesus lost their lives because of their faithful service to him. Sometimes a fight is necessary, be it a physical one, a spiritual one. Sometimes the type of fight that we're called to is to allow others to harm sometimes even to kill us, and to not fight back. So that's a kind of battle in and of itself. In light of the things that people were called to do before us, Israel called to wage war on all of Canaan, early followers of Jesus being crucified or burned at the stake or fed to wild animals, I think that you and I can probably afford to give a little bit more of ourselves. To set aside offenses a little bit easier, to take criticism a little bit better, to pray a little bit more, to forgive more, but also, when necessary, to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves in whatever way we are capable. Sometimes fighting is necessary, but God fights his way, not ours, and we need to make sure that we do as well. Wherever you act, wherever you take a stand, or whatever offense you choose to overlook, make sure what you are doing is the will of God. And sooner or later, in this life or the next, you'll win. Let's pray. Lord, help us to fight battles in ways that are honoring to you, to pray when we need to pray, fast when we need to fast, to push and fight and argue when it's necessary, and to overlook offenses and to love our enemies when that's called for. God, help everything that we do be an attempt to bring people to reconciliation with you and with one another. Help us to be fierce warriors, but also to be peaceful monks. Help us to be a nation of priests and evangelists, people who love you and who love others, but those who have a strong sense of justice, who will not overlook wrongdoing forever. Help us to do right by you. And in the difficult situations when we don't know if it's time to fight or not, God, give us wisdom to make the decision that most honors you. And God, above all things, help us to look forward to you coming home, the day when you will lead us, when there will be no more uncertainty and there will be no more need for violence. Help us to look forward to that day when we can live peacefully with you and with other believers forever and ever. In Jesus' precious name we pray.